Merry Christmas and welcome to Agonomics with me, David Udall, the one-stop podcast if you're into economics and agriculture. It's also the perfect excuse to escape the clutches of the in-laws, even if it's just for a few minutes. But don't forget to thank them for any new socks they may have bought you. Speaking of talking to relatives, and given the events of recent weeks sparked by the new inheritance tax policy for farms, I thought I'd take the opportunity to explore the topic of succession and how to approach those tricky conversations. My colleague Amy Hughes previously tackled the subject on AHDB's sister podcast, Food and Farming, and I think some of the points raised are worth listening to again. Amy was joined by Lyn Sykes, globally renowned succession expert, and covered the basics of starting difficult conversations. What it means to be good at communication, seeing things from both sides, and how to talk about and address touchy situations early so they don't become more difficult in the future. Please follow or subscribe to Agonomics to make sure you don't miss an episode. New shows drop every Wednesday at midday, and please get in touch. Comment on any of AHDB's social channels or email us agonomics@ahdb.org.uk and let us know what you got from Santa. It's been a number of weeks since we had the Chancellor's budget, and there's been a lot of fallout, hasn't there, across a number of different things. But specifically from an agriculture world, the three things that we were worried about were the overall size of the agricultural budget and inflation eroding that over time, the change to the direct payments being tapered away at a faster rate, so impacting farm incomes and their expected income from subsidy schemes into 2025. But obviously the one that's got all of the headlines and has been, the significant subject has been around inheritance tax. And we've done some exploratory analysis on that to start off, showing some of the impacts on individual farms. Specifically, the fact I always remember, we looked at the beef and sheep sort of model farm that we have, that we produce, and it, in order to cover the sort of cost of inheritance tax, it took that model farm's income and profit from around £19,000 of profit per year to about £3,000 of profit. So definitely a significant impact on the financial side of farms. And we're continuing to do that work, and we are developing a more detailed look at the impact of those inheritance tax changes by not only farm type, but also farm size as well, to help guide levy payers through this situation to understand how and if they could be implicated by the changes. So that's in the pipeline and being worked on, probably going to be released early in the new year. So we'll be looking out for that. And of course, it will be the topic of an Agonomics podcast when we get around to it. But today's podcast, we're going to be hearing from Lyn Sykes, who is the succession expert. And she was asked by my colleague Amy for her top tips on how to approach the subject of succession.
The four things that I think are really important to understand that I believe underlie and influence the succession process. First of all is the family history. People tend not to have a great knowledge of their own family history in previous generations. And when I start a family meeting, that was always the first information I get, because many of us are influenced by information that is in our subconscious, that actually relates to our lived experience, but we're often not really aware of it. So that's the first thing, the family history in relation to succession. The second thing is the self-esteem of the people involved. And that is actually an enormous factor that infiltrates every area of the process. The fact that people make a careless error in what they say and it impacts on people's perception of themselves. I think in relation to succession, the other thing that you can't underestimate is how vulnerable every generation is when it comes to succession. The older generation think that they're the only ones that are vulnerable, and the younger generation think that they're the only ones that are vulnerable. But in fact, they are equally vulnerable, and often that vulnerability is the logjam that many families hit. So that's family history, self-esteem, the ability of families to communicate effectively about anything, but particularly about sensitive subjects. My belief is that to be in a family business, you need to have much better communication skills than you do to be in any other business, because there is so much more riding on it. And lastly is the belief systems of the generations. So getting a handle on what are the important things to each generation in any process is a really important factor because they're quite different. You know, I look at my children and their belief system seems, I sometimes shake my head and think, who are these kids' parents? I think those four things are really important. So the reason I wanted to mention those before we started talking was that any converser needs to have those things in mind and be prepared to be open and honest about each one of those. So in an ideal world, the first conversation about succession starts when children start being involved in any way in farm activity, you know, from really little tackers to when they finish school. But a crucial conversation is the one that happens before a new generation returns to the family business. Because one of the things that makes the second generation vulnerable is often the length of time they've been there before the conversation happens. And so the thing that I hear is that young generation feel trapped, that they've already put what they think are the best years of their working life into their parents' family business, and they feel as though they can't leave and do something else. You know, I would be thinking a really progressive family should not take anyone into their family business whose family until some of those conversations have been had. One of the things that gives the older generation security, really, and a little bit of power is actually having the financial means to not be dependent on the farm. In Australia, we call that superannuation, whether that's actually in a superannuation fund or whether it's in assets off the farm. But the ability to not be reliant on the family business for their ongoing financial needs is an incredibly helpful factor. So if the older generation can secure their income and where they live, the whole process is going to go a whole lot better.
You talked about one of your four main areas being able to communicate effectively. Now, there might be some people listening to this thinking, well, I can talk, I can communicate. Will you just explain what you mean by communicate effectively? What skills do you need to have to be an effective communicator?
When I first started doing this work, I didn't deal with anyone who was thinking about returning to the farm. Some of the people had been there 20, 30, sometimes 40 years and succession hadn't happened. And I'd say, you know, how's your communication? Oh, pretty good. Yeah. So how did you go getting your sex education? And they say, oh, you know, and there's always a bit of stuttering. And I say, well, my experience about talking to your children about sex is that, you know, you might give a bit of a broad brush about how babies are made, or you might take a little bit of talk about protection. But my experience is not many parents talk to their children about the real nitty-gritty of sex. And if you do, then you've probably got good communication.
Yeah.
So that usually counts out everyone, really, including me.
Imagine. Yeah. I'm dreading that when mine get a bit bigger, yeah.
If you're observant and self-reflective, you're a long way to being able to communicate well. But people will say things and be shocked at the other person's reaction, but not ask them about it. You know, that often is the beginning of conflict. I say something, you react, I then defend myself, you attack me, and we're gone. Away we go, up on the conflict spiral. People underestimate how challenging it is to speak about really sensitive and important things with your own family. People think families are the safest place to communicate, but in fact, they're the least safe because there's so much riding on the outcomes.
And there's so much emotion in it as well, isn't there? Like when you're talking to a business partner or anybody else, it is literally just a conversation. But like you say, within a family, the history that's there will be having such a huge impact, and the emotion that you have for the person that you're speaking to can make you communicate in a very different way, can't it?
You start out wanting your children to be good and well-behaved and polite, and so you spend a lot of time criticising them, has been my experience. That almost becomes the norm. And so anything you say to them, they take as an implied criticism. None of us like being criticised, so we all react. You know, you get caught in that action-reaction
That was Lyn Sykes, globally renowned succession expert, speaking to my colleague Amy Hughes earlier this year. We'll have more from the pair of them after a short break for the latest market update.
Hi, I'm Olivia Bonser, Senior Analyst at AHDB, with a look at grain and oilseed markets for the week commencing the 6th of January. Despite some support in wheat markets over the Christmas period, prices have been under pressure in the new year from a strengthening US dollar, technical selling and sluggish global demand. However, Russian wheat crop conditions remain in focus, with warmer than usual temperatures and excess moisture in key growing regions. Persistent hot and dry weather in Argentina is also raising concern over the country's maize crop, which is now in its critical development stage. For rapeseed, new crop prices are supported, with doubts over prospects for global rapeseed production in 2025, though forecasts of heavy soybean supplies from South America limit any major price increases. Over the next few weeks, weather in major exporting countries such as South America and Russia will be key in driving prices. The USDA will also release updated global supply and demand estimates at the end of this week. To stay up to date with the latest data and analysis across arable, red meat and dairy markets, head to hdb.org.uk and click on Markets and Prices.
If you're in the market for another podcast to subscribe to, then look no further than our Manager's Special, AHDB's Food and Farming podcast. Recent episodes include a consumer insight offering on red meat labels and supermarket aisles, as well as a dairy special about our work with retailers to promote milk. If you're after herbs, or rather herbal lays, our shelves are stacked with sage advice on how to introduce lucerne and clover into your fields. In fact, we cater for all tastes, so you'll find sections dedicated to all sectors: pork, cereals and oilseeds, dairy and beef and lamb. And don't forget our middle aisle, where you can often pick up a bargain episode you didn't know you needed to listen to. Search Food and Farming wherever you get your podcasts. AHDB thanks you for your custom.
So we're back for the second half of Agonomics, talking about succession. And before we get into that, let's just talk about mental health for a second, because this is obviously a topic which has caused a lot of uncertainty with the changes to the budget and inheritance tax. Obviously, we're talking about a very sensitive subject, something that needs to be taken very seriously. So if this is something that creates anxiety and is creating a negative impact on you, then let's remind ourselves there's a significant number of mental health resources out there. We've got them listed on our website, and not only from a farming perspective, but also from a wider perspective for anyone that needs support as well. So if this is something that does cause a bit of a challenge, then please do look out for those services and reach out. Right, let's hear more from succession expert Lyn Sykes, who talks about the relevance of using a will.
If I've come into a business on a planned, work for equity, or however that transition's going to happen, then the will be less relevant. Mm-hmm. I think succession will be much easier when the will is irrelevant. I've yet to be convinced that the will is an effective way to transfer assets. If you've got nothing else, then the will is the succession plan. So again, if we go back to the beginning, before a new generation comes into a business, they need to know what their career future is. And if the will is the only succession tool, then they need to know what's going to happen to them if there's a tragedy. If in fact that information won't be shared, I think that's a real red flag that maybe this is not a good career move for me. The difficulty is that people are so emotionally bound to farming on their family's business that they often make decisions with something other than their brain. That the flags might be there, but people choose to ignore them. So to me, if we go back to the things that we've said, if I as the older generation can set myself up how I'm going to be financially and where I will live, then in many ways the will is less relevant as you age. The point when wills are really crucial is when you're young, when you're your age. Mm-hmm. What's going to happen? I can remember My husband worked in the canola industry and we were going to Canada to a conference. We had 5 little kids and I was going. And I panicked. What will happen if something happens to us while we're away? I went to all sorts of extreme measures to set up how they were going to be managed. I got on the plane and I think I cried for about the first 3 hours of the trip. We both came back alive, so it wasn't necessary. But a will is supposedly a living document. So you can't write it and then forget it for the next 40 years. It needs to be upgraded and refreshed, looked at. Does it need to change? Has anything changed that needs to change in this document? Yeah. A succession shouldn't mean death, because the magical part of succession is for an older generation watching the next generation succeed, being able to be there and observe and support and encourage. Not criticise and question, support and encourage, and see the fruits of not only their physical labour, but their family labour coming to fruition. It's just such a wonderful gift when you see it in action. You know, I really want to take the focus off the wills and say, if you're on the ball, your will, hopefully in the long term, is not going to mean much. The other thing that is important here, and maybe the same there, is if I'm no longer able to care for myself and I need to go into care, what it costs me is based on my assets. So if I still own a huge chunk of valuable farming land, what I pay to go into care here, I don't know whether it's different there, will be based on that asset. I've actually been involved with farms that have had to be sold in order for the parents to access care. So I always say, when you need to go into care, you need to be poor or very rich.
Yeah.
And not have a business you want to pass on.
I think what you just said about the positives of a good succession plan, I think that's what we'll leave it on Lyn, because that's absolutely, I deal with both sides of the sword. I speak to people that have got it nailed, and they have such incredible communication between a family, and I speak to people and live with people in some cases that are the total opposite, and the difference that it makes to farming businesses and the people is just it's just amazing, isn't it, when you get it right, or at least try get it some way near rather than just ignoring it.
Imagine the joy of driving around in a vehicle with 2 generations in a paddock like the one behind you, the enormous pride that they can both feel and share for the previous contribution and the future contribution. It's, it really is an absolute joy.
Yeah.
If, in fact, that's not the case and it has all gone to the dogs, my advice is bring it to a head, get it over with as quickly as possible, finish it up so that the family has time to heal while people are around. I think one of the nicest things I've ever had said to me was at a conference in a sheep, I think, and it went to questions afterwards. And a guy stood up who I recognised, and he said, Lyn ran a family meeting for us. And of course, my thought was, oh God, was it a disaster or was it helpful? Because you never quite know what people are going to say in a public forum. And he said, unbeknownst to us, my father was to die 6 weeks later. And he said the most wonderful gift was that we could grieve without it being contaminated by the family business.
That seems a poignant place to leave the conversation between Lyn Sykes and my colleague Amy Hughes. You can hear their full conversation by searching for the Food and Farming Podcast. And as a reminder, check out the AHDB website for a more measured analysis on the farming inheritance tax and the impact on your business. Finally, Merry Christmas, and please make it your New Year's resolution to subscribe to Agonomics wherever you listen to podcasts, and enjoy those pigs in blankets.